Afternoon, everyone. This is a meeting of the Devens Jurisdiction Framework Committee. Today is March 12th, 2025. My name is Victor Normand. I will chair this meeting. I'll now call the roll. Janice Livingston.
Here.
Robert Pontbriand.
Here.
Rich Maori. Dan Nason. Brian Sawyer.
Here.
Logan Breeze.
Here.
Ryan Hildebrand. Bill Marshall.
Here.
Neil Angus.
Here.
John Catter.
Here.
Odile Smith. Kristen Cullen. We have a majority. We are in order. Minutes for our meeting of February 12th. Any comments? Questions?
Oh, we have a question over here.
I would just request that the
Jim?
spelling of my last name be corrected.
Spelling of his last name.
Yes.
Okay.
It's ER, not AR.
Why isn't this showing up on the screen?
Don't know.
Geller? Do not know.
I don't know either. So is this supposed to be showing up on the screen, Max?
I'm plugging it back in.
Again? Okay. I hate this.
I'll be back in a few minutes.
Who was that?
That was Max.
My
IT guy?
Yeah. All right. So we're having technical difficulties.
Okay, on to the minutes. Hearing no objections, is there a motion to approve the minutes?
So moved.
Second. Is that Bill? Second by Robert. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say nay. Without objection, the minutes are approved unanimously.
All right. I don't.
Stakeholder updates.
God's sake, I hate this new system.
Town of Air.
Mr. Chair, the update from the Town of Air, our local committee last met with the superintendent of Air Shirley Regional School District to sort of talk about education and schools as it relates to Air and Devens into the future. That's sort of part of the committee's due diligence. We have another meeting, I think it's going to be scheduled for the end of this month, beginning of April, where the committee is going to invite Janice Livingston to come talk a little bit about the framework efforts for the benefit of our local committee. And then we're going to be looking at beginning to sort of shape an outline of our sort of local study, if you will, to start to shape that, because our committee's met with, I think at this point, almost all of the town departments related to it. So that's sort of our update. Thanks.
Very good, thank you. Town of Harvard. Most of our meeting was spent on updates. And the only thing I've noticed is that we've begun to receive some current financial information from Mass Development, some assessment information, and the most recent balance sheet, which I'll share with this committee going forward. And that's it from Harvard. Town of Shirley, updates?
We do not have anything significant from last time.
Devens, John?
No current updates since our last meeting, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, Enterprise Commission, Neil or Bill? If somebody...
Thanks, Mr. Chair. We've been busy reviewing a few things, the DGFC matrix, which we'll present a little bit later. And I believe the housing working group is on the agenda as well, too, for an update. Been actively busy with that group as well. So we'll give an update for that a little later in the agenda. So I don't think there's anything else unless you have anything, Mr. Marshall.
Nope.
Okay, very good, thank you. Under old business, DJFC working group update. A lot has happened since we last met. Robert, would you like to start off
Sure,
with the conversation that you and Neil had?
Sure. Mr. Chair, so just to briefly just frame for everybody's benefit, including mine, back over the summer, you'll recall, we applied for a housing choice grant from the state. When I say we, it was from the Devens Framework Committee applied. The town of Air was the administrative sponsor for the grant because you needed to have a municipal sponsor. For that, we applied for that grant also under strong urging and support from Senator Eldridge and Senator Cronin, Representative Senna. And some of us had met with the secretary in August in her office, and they really wanted us to apply for this grant, which we did. And I think we had a 48-hour or 72-hour turnaround on that grant application. We awarded the grant for $300,000. The timeline was that the state would begin the contracting in January, in that under the normal scope, we would have about 18 months to do the work. This framework committee will recall after we got the grant, we had a discussion about topics for the grant, if you will, or things that we would use the grant for. And there was a consensus at that time to do two things. One was to look at financial impacts or financial issues related to disposition, and the framework committee authorized a working group to work on the RFP for the grant. And that working group has consisted of the chair, myself, Brian Sawyer from Shirley, Jim Geller representing Devens, and Neil from the DEC, and Dan Nason from Harvard. And we've had a series of meetings, as the framework committee knows, working on developing this RFP for this project. Well, recently, it was around the time of the last housing meeting up at Devens, the state, Ms. Chris Clutchman, who is the grant administrator for this particular grant, had approached Neil Angus and I, raising some concerns about the specific approach to that grant, and her concerns being that, yes, what we're looking to do is a piece of it, but they, meaning the grant administrators, would like us to look at potentially some additional issues or some other issues more in line with the scope of the grant. At that time, Neil and I decided, we brought Victor into the discussion, and we met with Chris to further have a discussion regarding next steps. The takeaways are they would like to see a revised scope to our approach. Secondly, they have agreed, because there's been a delay anyhow, to extend the timeline on the grant, both in terms of the time we would have to do the work, up to 24 months as opposed to the standard year, and that there's some latitude there. And in that discussion, with Chris, we said that we would be coming back to the framework group to further discuss this and discuss how we want to approach it. It sounds like, and I'm speaking from my perspective, if we don't sort of tailor our approach or so forth, we may not be consistent with the grant, and that could pose some issues which we're not looking to do. And that's why we want to have the discussion this afternoon. So I think that frames it. Feel free, you or Neil, if I missed something, to add in.
Right. Neil, you participated in both phone calls. What's your take on anything you can add to what Robert has said?
I don't think I need to add anything. I think Robert did a great job of summarizing kind of, where we're at. And we did put together, a draft based on, kind of directing away from the RFP. Chris Clutchman had said that we're a little premature in drafting an RFP for a consultant. Let's take a step back and look at identifying and finalizing that scope that Robert was defining. So I think that's kind of where we're at now. We did kind of draft a rough scope. This was just a first cut, and did circulate it. It was included as part of the amended agenda for today. So I think that's where we're at and open for discussion.
Okay, very good. Okay, so my take on it, the one Zoom meeting that I attended earlier this week was an acknowledgement on the part of Chris Clutchman that the grant clearly had two focuses. The grant application had two focuses. One was on the jurisdiction side, and the other was on the housing side, and that it, as Robert said, that application was submitted in the summer. Subsequently, the the economic development legislation passed, which called for the creation of a housing working group to look at housing in the Innovation and Technology Center. And as a result of that, she and her department have decided that the grant should be used to study housing impacts and not matters related to jurisdiction directly. And so the document that you received just within the past day or two is contains elements of a housing impact study. This has not been approved by the state, and it does what we're suggesting. It does include, and if you look at the very last paragraph, a focus remaining on looking at the financial. We're referring to here as the financial sustainability of Devens as a municipality going forward. And again, she and her department have not approved this. So it's clearly not in the direction that this committee and the working group was headed in. I think we're probably one meeting away from having finalized a draft of an RFP to bring back to this committee, and this really throws a monkey wrench into that plan. So I just open it up for a discussion this afternoon on how we should deal with the matter before us. It is unresolved at this point. So would anyone like, now I'm going to ask the committee's indulgence. Jim Geller has attended the meetings of the working group, the RFP working group. He is an alternate member of this committee. John Catter, who is the member of this committee, is also in attendance. So I'm going to ask the board's indulgence to allow Jim to also contribute to this discussion.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for that introduction. Oh, I'm sorry. Can I?
Go ahead, speak, John.
Sure. So, thanks for the summary. So if we think about this body's charge, the DGFC is tasked with conducting and delivering a study on jurisdictional options for Devens in 2033. And that's what the original grant request was intended to be used for. And this is not directed at anybody. This is just an observation that I have made and that numerous of my constituents have called me about as they saw the recent DGFC package. So we spent the better part of the past 3 years developing and publicly releasing a well thought out and collaboratively developed RFEI on this topic, as you just said, Mr. Chairman. The town of Air submitted the grant request, as Robert said, to fund the study, and we received feedback that it was partially funded with a $300,000 grant award, as Robert, you had mentioned. A subcommittee was formed to develop the revised initial RFP with Jim Geller leading it, including all parties, that has partially completed that task of what you mentioned. On Monday, we did receive a revised one-step grant narrative that is no longer focused on jurisdiction, but housing.
Thank you.
Couple challenges with that. Problem number one, not all stakeholders were aware of the changes that were going to occur, and Jim Geller can talk to that. So on Monday, we communicated this isn't at all what we had developed in terms of our initial attempt to revise an RFP to focus more on the financials. The challenge that my constituents also brought to me is this new housing document is not in this committee's charter and should not be advanced by this committee. Jurisdiction and housing should not be intermingled. Let the housing working group utilize these funds as part of the legislative initiative of the working group that has been established that has representatives from the town of Air, from the town of Harvard, the DEC, certain cabinet secretaries, the town of Shirley, and the residents. So it is our position and my position as the DGFC representative for the residents of Devens that there should be no further activity on this document as it relates to housing on Devens. That is not the purview of this committee. That is not the charter of this committee. And perhaps, Robert, you could work with the housing working group up on Devens to repurpose that money, talk to Chris Kletchman. The study should be done. No doubt there's a lot that needs to be studied on the innovation and technology sector, the how we redevelop that, the best way to develop that. The argument is not that that does not need to be done. It does. The discussion, it's pretty clear that this committee needs to separate jurisdiction from housing, and because they need to be worked separately and jurisdiction should not be advanced. I don't think there's any support here on Devens for advancing a jurisdictional discussion before housing is developed. And I don't believe there's any support in the legislature for advancing a jurisdictional discussion before housing is developed. But our position is that there should be no further activity on this document as it relates to as it relates to housing with this committee.
Okay. Thank you, John. Other comments? Neil, would you like to add to this? I'm trying to draw you in because I think you're more sensitive to the needs of the Department of Housing in livable cities.
Communities, yeah.
In livable communities.
I don't disagree with John. You know, like I do disagree that housing is not. Housing is a component of jurisdiction. It's one component of jurisdiction. I don't think they're completely separate issues, but I am in agreement that, yeah, this is really not the full charge of this committee. That being said, you know, our discussions with Chris Kletchman, she also mentioned, you know, this is one grant. We could utilize, you know, the committee could utilize this grant to explore the housing issue specifically as it relates to Devens, as it relates to Air, as it relates to Harvard, as it relates to Shirley. And we could use additional funding at a future date to continue on other disposition items, you know, that have come up as issues. So I'll be the first one to say that at one of the last meetings, I was saying housing is not the sole purpose of this commission or this committee. I was saying the same thing John was saying. I was saying it was part of the discussion. It is not the discussion. Just like a financial analysis of mass development is not the jurisdiction question. It's a piece of the jurisdiction question. So, you know, I throw that out there as, you know, this is money that has been offered to the committee to look into one issue that is a topic of disposition, which is housing.
Okay, good. Brian, what are your thoughts on this?
You know, I think at the last meeting that I was present for, you know, I share some of the same thoughts that Neil does. You know, I definitely do recognize and agree that, you know, that housing is not the main charge of this committee, which I don't, you know, I think everyone seems to be in agreement of that. But, you know, I do think that housing, you know, was one of the items that we did list originally as one of the components that would need to be studied in an overall jurisdiction disposition study. So I don't have terribly strong feelings one way or the other. I think housing would have to be a part of looking at, overall jurisdiction. But I also agree that it's not our main, it's definitely not our main focus.
Janice, I know this is all being dumped on you pretty suddenly, but what's your reaction to all this?
First, I just want to apologize to everybody for the screen sharing not working today. I don't know why, but all the information that we're talking about is in the packet and is on the Devens Jurisdiction Framework Committee's website, which is on the agenda. So I just want to, so everything is there that you can see. We don't know why it's not working. So I just want to put that out there because I'm really frustrated at that. I agree. I mean, the thing with housing is that, housing is always a discussion, whether you're building a new town or whatever, okay? Housing is always being discussed. As far as jurisdiction goes, and I've stated, and I please don't anybody misunderstand what I'm saying, is if it comes to the jurisdiction is to go back to the towns, there's going to be some tweaking so that nobody's house is in two jurisdictions. But that's something that we can't discuss until the future because we don't know where everything's going to be landing, okay? Just like, everybody worries about, well, we're going to have to build a school. Well, we don't know if we're going to have to build a school because we don't know how much housing is going to be. We don't know how many people are going to have kids. There are some things that are just, I'm kind of pragmatic, so it's kind of hard. I can visualize so much, but we are getting ahead of ourselves. Yeah.
Okay.
Mr. Chair, if I could respond to that, thank you, Janice. There's
John.
no argument that this needs to be studied. That's not the point. That's not what the point that my constituency's been making. There's no doubt that housing is going to have an impact on some jurisdictional discussion. The bottom line is the housing working group that's up at Devens meeting, I think monthly, is legislatively mandated. And all these items are specifically housing based. If there's a later source of funding, the dollars can be reallocated appropriately to the DGFC. I mean, that can happen. That can be done with a snap of the fingers. Just the fact that this grant request is not, there's no room for this DGFC to have a decision about housing. This list should land with the working group. Right, the working group is legislatively mandated to make these recommendations, and it should stay there. No argument that it should be studied, but it should stay with the working group, housing working group that's being convened by the cabinet secretary.
Okay. Now, Jim, I'm going to ask you, could you just, before this introduction of the housing element, the working group of this committee was working on an RFP, and you and I worked on the actual scope of work. Do you want to just kind of summarize where we were headed before 10 days ago?
Sure.
You want to come up to?
In putting together the scope as I thought it was going to be until I saw the package, we were really focused on the work that this committee had done in putting together the RFEI and taking parts from that were germane to what we would use the $300,000 grant for. And so that was primarily task number 2 in the RFEI, which was data collection. And so this current scope that's being discussed is completely different, obviously, than what we had originally intended, and where I thought that we were going. So I mean, I think that's apparent to everybody, and so I don't need to belabor that point. The observation that I would make, though, that in addition to what has already been said, is if that housing group started having discussions about jurisdiction, I would be upset. It's not within their framework. It's not within their purview.
And they have been told that too.
Right. And so if I'm in that housing group and this group starts to do the work of that group, if I was in that group, I would be upset. Yeah, I'm sorry, but I like John Catter said, it's not that this doesn't need to be done, it's where it should be done, how it should be done, who does it belong to? I'm sorry, but I don't believe it belongs with this group.
Chair, if I may.
Janice?
I think what's happened is that we, in trying to figure out, what this committee, working on the jurisdiction, when all these other conversations start coming about, we just kind of naturally as human beings want to discuss it, but I think everybody's pointed out, it's not our lane. And I think we need to just get back to over here. Obviously, if, one of our members, especially from this committee, is on that housing group committee, if they want to just give us an update, because the benefit of that is also for the public to know too. So if they're not paying attention to that working group meeting, but they're paying attention to this, then they get an update, okay? That's fine, but I do think we need to kind of get back into our lanes and streamline, what it is we're supposed to do.
Okay. All right, if I could call everybody's attention to the document that you recently received. Includes all the components of what might be included in a housing impact study. Housing market, business environment, transportation, utilities, schools, healthcare, and environmental issues, historic district, taxes, governance, voting, surrounding land uses. The point I raised to Chris Clutchman is that has been repeated here. That's beyond our scope, and I think it's quite beyond our ability as a volunteer group to deal with all these issues. The question I would ask is, while these issues are germane, or could be germane, to the work of the housing working group, there's another player in this, and that's mass development. What among these issues would not also apply to mass development's efforts to develop housing on land already zoned for housing? Wouldn't mass development have to address any impact issues that the housing working group may raise with respect to their area? Wouldn't they also have to deal with those issues for the housing they should develop? And where I'm going with this is that this work to do a housing impact study belongs with mass development. And clearly, if there's a housing impact that affects the innovation and technology centered district, isn't it also going to affect the district that's zoned for housing currently? And I don't, Neil, maybe you know this, I don't know if the two districts physically touch one another, but if not, they're clearly in the same quadrant of Devens, that the issues the housing group may face are also issues that mass development is going to face. And the other issue I raised with Chris is that she also thought that this grant money could be used to prepare the communities for a super town meeting. And I pointed out to her that for every super town meeting that has been held to date, it has been mass development that done the preparation for those meetings. And I, in addition to the concerns that have been raised, John, most forcefully about this not being the work of this committee, clearly taking on the responsibility for preparing a super town meeting specifically to rezone for housing is well beyond the charter of this group. So I'd like to.
Mr. Chair, if I could answer that, thank you. Well put, Neil. You can answer this better, but mass development is involved extensively with the housing working group.
Right.
So
remember.
you're 100% right. They should have eyes and input into anything that happens from a building standpoint in Devens, and they are active participants and members of the housing working group.
Yeah, exactly.
Beyond that, I can't comment. Neil, I don't know if you want to.
I would just add that, all these issues that, are listed that Victor just labeled off in the attached kind of draft that was presented to you, which again was just put forth to the committee for discussion purposes only, right? Um, Based on our conversations and the direction that Chris Clutchman is steering the the focus of the grant, or asking us to look at the focus of the grant. Um, I would point out that these are all issues that were identified as part of our jurisdiction process. But everyone is absolutely right that this is specifically focused on housing, but tax implications, transportation, fiscal impacts, schools, these are all things that that we've been talking about for years with jurisdiction. And some of the key issues, school population, school enrollment, who's going to pay for the school age children? What if a new school is needed? Would we need to plan for a new school on Devens or in the region? These are things that are, you know, applicable to both housing and the disposition discussion. So when we had this conversation with Chris initially, we said, okay, well, let's look at what the common issues are between disposition and housing, and put those as part of what we would consider looking at in a housing study. So that's kind of where the existing draft came from. It was just put together very quickly by our small RFP working group that everybody wasn't participating in. So it was, we wanted to have something for the group to react to. So this is good. This is a good discussion. I don't think anybody should take offense to this coming forward. This is what the state is suggesting. And if it's not in our purview, then, we should say so. I think there's opportunity. The housing working group can't do all this stuff on its own. So I don't think there's a territorial issue here in terms of, if somebody else wants to help out with the housing studies or any type of study. I think the housing group would be open to it. I'm not speaking for the housing group, although I am on it. But just kind of throwing that out there as some background for folks too. Again, these are all issues that were identified as part of jurisdiction. If we're not the entity to do this, if mass development should be doing it, or if, I think, John, you and I had a brief conversation. You had mentioned maybe, a separate working group or committee, a subset of the DGFC could consider taking on this. That would allow AIR to continue to manage the grant, technically on behalf of the DGFC, but it's not really. I guess it wouldn't be on behalf of DGFC. But throwing that out there as an idea too, not to steal your thunder, John, but.
No, you're good. You're good. You're good.
Yeah. No, I
No,
think,
I agree. I think, but I want to, Mr. Chairman, you said forcefully, and I apologize if I came across strong, but I have such respect for everybody on this panel. We have spent how many years together talking through these issues, and it's a lot of work, and I give everybody here a lot of credit for doing this. And I think having all of us having lived with these issues and talked through these issues, multiple meetings, multiple hours, we have a level of understanding that perhaps not all parties do. There are nuances to what this charter is here, and perhaps some parties aren't aware of that, the restrictions placed upon us by our charter. So perhaps it's a matter of educating all parties that say this is probably not, doesn't fit right here. Not saying it doesn't need done. It's probably better over here. It's an easy conversation to have. So I just wanted to, 2 points. Number one, I so respect everybody on this committee. We're all doing fantastic work. And two, perhaps some conversations about what these charters actually mean for each committee.
okay, thank you, John.
Sure.
I think before we try to reach some kind of an accommodation with the state, I think we ought to make another run at convincing them that the $300,000 that they have is best used to look at jurisdiction broadly, but more specifically to the finances of a Devens municipality. And just to put this in financial perspective, we knew when we got 300,000, wasn't going to be enough money to do a comprehensive study on jurisdiction, and zeroed in on looking at the financial aspect of it. And I think that is still incredibly valid. Whereas we have, and then hoping that that would lead to other funding, that we could pursue other aspects with respect to jurisdiction. But to put things in financial perspective, we have 300,000. I mentioned earlier that Mass Development had provided its most recent balance sheet to the Harvard Devens Jurisdiction Committee. And looking at that balance sheet, which I have before me now, I see that listed as among their assets is cash. And the cash total for the Devens Fund and Devens Utilities is over $70 million. That's cash. That's not any physical assets. That's cash that's available to Mass Development. And that's not Mass Development's money. That is money that belongs to the Devens project. And to think that you couldn't ask Mass Development to perform any housing impact studies that the housing working group might need, I think is ludicrous. That they have the resources and the experience and the staff to do that kind of a study. So I think we ought to, as I said, we ought to make a run at trying to convince Chris Clutchman and her agency to allow this committee to proceed along the lines that we had decided to work with. And what I'd like to suggest is that we write a letter to Chris Clutchman and include some of the points that have been mentioned here at this meeting, and copy that letter to, and I'll open it up for discussion, who might, if we agree to send such a letter, who might be copied on that. So any thoughts on my idea of writing a letter to Chris Clutchman?
Mr. Chairman, what would that letter include? I don't think we have enough information to craft a letter from all of us to send it. What would be the objective of this letter?
The objective would be basically to reiterate that the purpose of this committee and its intention is to work towards jurisdiction. And that was really clear in the grant application. It did mention housing, for sure, but there's a Section 23, which prescribes the final report, is included in the grant application. So there, and Chris Clutchman admitted as much. He said that they understood the grant was that was the focus of the grant, but it did have a housing component to it, and she thought in the best interest of her agency that money should be shifted towards housing impact study and not matters related to jurisdiction. So the purpose of the letter, John, would be to redirect, to request that the department allow us to proceed along the lines that we had initially laid out. Is that clear, John?
On jurisdiction, you mean?
Yes.
Mr. Chair, I'm gonna back up a little bit on my, my support for the financial, the strict focus on financial. I think I've been pretty consistent in saying that we should not just be looking at finances. Just like we're talking about housing, we should not be looking at finances independent of everything. I think we definitely, as part of jurisdiction, we need to understand the operational costs, how things are being run and managed at Devens right now, to understand what would it cost for the different scenarios. But, getting that information is supporting background for our study. Things are going to change by between now and 2033. There's going to be new development. There's going to be, there likely will be more residents and houses built, conditions are going to change, but understanding the operational costs, I think, is a better focus than just saying, you know, we want to focus on a financial impact study on how, you know, mass development operates. We need to understand how, you know, what it costs to operate, and then we can look at, are there efficiencies or better ways to do it in different scenarios, right? I think that's a more amicable approach than just saying we want to focus on a fiscal impact study.
Jim, maybe you can help me out here. I think that the way that it's unfortunate that we weren't able to move forward with our draft document and bring it to this committee. But the direction we were moving in terms of the scope of work, did not include a financial analysis of mass development or how they were spending their money, but rather how revenue is being collected and revenue is being spent on the operation of Devens. It was not intended, given the funds available, it was not intended to be an assessment of how those funds were being spent. It was not intended to be a document that looked at the ability of the three towns to provide services. It was intended to be, as Jim mentioned earlier, a data-driven analysis, just looking at some of the expenses are really clear. What they spend on police, fire, education are really clear, but there's a whole raft of other expenses to the tune of about $8 million a year that mass development spends at Devens, and it essentially is having a consultant look at that $8 million and determining what is a municipal expense that is going to be ongoing and be the responsibility of the community, and what expenses are redevelopment related that at some point end, and what revenues are municipal in nature, like property tax, and which revenues are redevelopment in nature, like land sale revenue. And just painting a clear picture of what the municipal expenses are at Devens. So, Neil, I think at some point in the future, there may be jurisdictions that want to look at more detail at the provision of services and how they're being provided, but that clearly wasn't the direction that the RFP working group was headed.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, I think perhaps and this is just a suggestion, the cleanest way to do this, the working group has to turn this report, I think by the end of May, it has to be done. Their working group housing working group has to submit their recommendations to the legislature and the governor. I think within by the end of May. Neil, I'm wrong. I don't know, but very quickly. So perhaps the cleanest way to do that is just to ask what the more appropriate funding source should be, rather than try to repurpose this funding source. My guess it's going to be challenging, and then perhaps we ask our legislators, listen, the cleanest way to do this is probably another grant, a different grant, repurposed exclusively for jurisdiction. That I think would be a pretty clean path. In any event.
Restate that again, Jim. I'm not. Yeah, I'm
sorry, Mr. Chairman. So the one thing I think is the working group has to turn their recommendation to the governor and the legislature, I believe, within 60 days. It has to be done. Their work has to be completed. So I think perhaps the cleanest path, rather than try to repurpose, I don't know, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a legislator, I don't know how, if you can repurpose the current grant to do a purely jurisdictional, I don't know how that works. Perhaps the cleanest path is to go back to Ms. Clutchman and the relevant parties and say, what is the best funding source, given the restrictions that this committee has, down the road, a month, 2 months, 3 months, where we can get an additional grant that is more appropriately targeted for a jurisdictional study. That's what I'm saying.
Well, what would we use the current grant for? It's not clear to me.
I think he's saying that the current grant would go to the housing group. It would be rescinded.
I mean, is there?
I don't know how that works, Robert.
Yeah.
You know better than I don't know how.
My understanding.
That would be
Brian?
My understanding, as I think Robert had touched upon, is, a little bit of background of how we got to, producing this, and it was a quick turnaround with not the entire, framework committee present, but just kind of the small working group. It was at the recommendation of Chris Clutchman that, what we had proposed for our scope for the grant didn't meet kind of what they had expected for their criteria. And so this was a very quick attempt to, meet what their expectations were. Is it possible that we have now a larger input with the larger, group to try and find something that has more consensus that we think could still utilize these funds, get the grant, help us with our jurisdiction studies, but maybe have a different approach that would also satisfy Chris Clutchman? As if focusing on housing isn't what the committee wants to move forward with, is there some other component that we could modify it to that they would accept it?
Oh, I think that question was asked and answered, and it was clear, in my view, and correct me, Robert and Neil, that her expectation is that this grant would be focused on the impacts of housing. I mean,
I think you're correct.
That would
Yeah.
be correct.
Jim? Why don't you sit over here, Jim, and just,
Mr. Chair, unfortunately, I do have a hard stop at 4. Jim can talk in my stead when I have to drop.
okay.
I just want to make an observation, and that is this housing group, as John had pointed out, has to report back to the governor within a certain time frame. And I'm not quite sure when that is, but end of May or end of June, somewhere in there. Okay, so here we sit in the middle of April. All right, and
March.
if I'm sorry, March. Thank you. Got a little ahead of myself.
Daylight savings.
But
Not too far ahead.
but in 2.5 months, we'll be to June 1st. And so my question, my observation would be, you're going to do any kind of a study that's substantive, that's worth anything, and get it to the housing group in time for decisions that are going to be made in terms of a recommendation that goes back to the governor. That's just not realistic. So even if we can find a way to move forward with something that this committee would agree with and that fits with the governor's office, from a time standpoint, that housing recommendation is going to go back to the governor before any study is going to be completed. I think we just have to understand that that's a reality.
Yeah, I agree with them. I think that, you guys put so much time and effort into the initial RFP document that took, a couple of months. In my mind, there's no feasible way of creating a new document within the next 2 weeks and then starting the study right away. I think it should go to the housing group, or if you can't convince them to change it to more directed towards this committee, or towards what they've already created, it should go towards the housing group or just be rescinded, because we're not going to be utilizing it to its full expectation. It's just going to be wasted otherwise.
Yeah, I do question the what the end product of the housing working group is going to be. Their expectation, according to the chair, is that their next meeting, which I think is like early April 1st or something like that, Neil?
Yes, April 1st.
Yeah, they're going to be working with a draft of a final document to be finalized a month later in May. So I question what the end product is going to look like. And I guess my concern right now would be to have Chris Clutchman, who sits on that committee, represent to the larger committee that we will be working on housing impacts. I think it would be a mistake to allow that to happen. So I think we need to
We can probably get to Chris Clutchman by tomorrow. whoever, someone takes the lead on that if you want to.
What do we tell her,
That's,
John?
that's a valid point. If you want to make the clarification that we've decided as a group that we're not going to be discussing housing on Devens, that can be communicated to Chris Fleischman tomorrow, today.
Okay, is that in the form of a motion, John?
You know what? I guess it is.
Okay. Is there a second?
Just what's the motion? I'm sorry.
Motion is,
Motion is to
make,
communicate to this group, should not, it's not in the charter of this group to, put forth a position on housing or study housing or use the money to study housing, on Devens.
okay,
Seconded.
that's pretty straightforward.
Solely housing on Devens, right?
Solely housing on Devens.
Okay. Seconded by Janice. Any further discussion on this?
I would just add, as a member of the working group, the housing working group, it's my understanding that, you know, this isn't going to come up with a full plan. The working group is going to come up with recommendations on what is needed to facilitate additional housing units in the ITC district. So I don't think it's the end result is a final plan. So this whatever plan is to be developed is not going to be done by May 14th or May 19th, whatever the date is of delivering that report. So.
Okay, but John's motion is pretty direct, that the communication to Chris Clutchman is that this group will not be using the grant money to focus on housing,
Solely. Right.
solely on housing.
Correct.
Further discussion?
If there's a revision, we consider it, but that's pretty direct.
Yep. Okay, on the motion, I'll call the roll. Janice Livingston,
Yes.
Robert Pontbriand,
Yes.
Rich Maori, Dan Mason, Brian Sawyer,
Yes.
Logan Breeze,
Yes.
Bill Marshall,
Yes.
Neil Angus,
No.
John Catter.
Yes.
The chair votes yes.
I was going to abstain, but I've been involved in the discussions, so.
Okay. So we have 7 yes, 1 no. The motion is approved. Now, who carries the message to Chris Clutchman?
I'll volunteer, Mr. Chair.
Okay.
And perhaps Neil and I. Neil?
Happy to assist, Robert.
Yeah.
My only concern, something needs to be put in writing. My only concern is I would not want to give the impression that this is the start of a negotiation. I think when I'm hearing from this committee, it's pretty firm.
Do you want to draft a letter, perhaps, Mr. Chairman, that we could
Okay.
Yeah.
circulate? It's up to you. I mean, we do want to be clear in this communication.
All right. Why don't, Robert, send me the motion as
Yep.
you've recorded?
Yep.
I'll turn that into a brief letter and I'll circulate it to the committee. Wait for a quick response and then send it on to Chris Clutchman. Okay? All right. Are we done with that topic for now? The next item on our agenda, Healy Driscoll Housing Economic Development Working Group update. I think we've gotten it in bits and pieces. Anybody feel as though we need more information on that? Neil, do we not discuss anything?
Just note, I think we might have talked about it, but the next meeting is April 1st. At the last meeting, the captains of the working group subcommittees presented their information gathering for the specific topics regarding, you know, current rules and regulations, community concerns, and innovative approaches to housing. So we're in the process of compiling those summary documents into some kind of report that will be presented to the full working group on April 1st. So encourage anyone who's interested to attend. That'll be at 1 p.m. at our offices on April 1st in the Vicksburg Conference Room at 33 Andrews Parkway.
Okay. Very good. Thanks, Neil. Next item is the Mass Development CEO update. That relates to our invitation to come back to the table and for her to come by for a visit. I think, was that John leaving?
Yeah, he just left.
Okay. So you're official now, Jim. Okay, so what I think what we had talked about at our last meeting was that once we completed our draft of an RFP, that we would use that as an entree to get to Mass Development, looking for their comments on that. I'd like to suggest that we continue to move in that direction, and along those lines, Robert and Neil, Jim, Brian, I think the RFP working group of this committee should continue to meet and move in the direction of preparing an RFP as we had envisioned it. Does that make sense? So we'll have it in our back pocket if somebody says, well, what are you guys really intending to do, or what would you like to do? Then we have a clear written document.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It doesn't, as you
I
said,
think that would make sense, yeah.
Okay, great.
and as you mentioned, Mr. Chair, earlier, we're about a meeting away from a draft for this group, so we
Okay.
should bring it to conclusion.
Okay, Robert, will you
I will,
schedule that meeting?
yep.
As soon as possible, in the event that we need 2 meetings before we meet again here, so that we can surely have it before the full framework committee at our next meeting. Okay, moving right along. New business, question 11, military issues and permanent government matrix issues. So we have submissions.
Devens working group is first.
Jim, are you familiar with this?
I am. I mean, I don't really have anything to add to it. I guess I would just say is if there's something there that raises questions that someone wants to ask about, ask away. Otherwise, I think it speaks for itself.
It is quite a thorough collection of federal uses and military. Are there any comments or questions on the submission from the Devens stakeholder group? Okay, next up is, Janice, you tell me.
Harvard.
Harvard, okay. So Harvard does not have a great deal of experience dealing with the military, or for that matter, other federal uses at Devens. But the town of Harvard recognizes that, as with all federal installations within municipalities have an obligation to provide the full spectrum of public services. And we also understand, the town of Harvard also understands, as is the case in every community, that federal property, military and otherwise, is exempt from local property taxation. I think the way that the town would approach it initially is to establish a liaison between the town and federal uses, looking for cooperation with from Mass Development and the Enterprise Commission. And then the town also would recognize the current advisory relationship that the Enterprise Commission has with military uses there, and would explore that. And finally, existing intergovernmental agreements involving the military and other federal uses, the town would be interested in taking action to provide a continuity of service there. So I think that is just an acknowledgement that the federal military and the federal uses are a significant portion of what is the Devens community. Okay, Neil, your submission on the matrix status quo.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. Pretty similar to the other submissions, Federal Bureau of Prisons, Department of Defense, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, Shriver Job Corps, Army National Guard. These are all the state and federal uses. We have reciprocal agreements with them. We do provide permitting and assistance when asked as the Devens Enterprise Commission. So that's kind of the note at the end, just to make communities aware that the special legislation that governs the redevelopment of Devens does provide for opportunities for collaboration and partnership with the military. So even though the federal uses are exempt from local zoning, sometimes we do cross-pollinate and cooperate with them.
Okay, very good. So we'll add this to our matrix. This was question number 11. There are 19 issues in all, so we're really working our way through it. Question number 12 for next time.
Did you want to hear Aaron?
Is that, I didn't,
That was the second packet that I had to send. Because I got late entries from some people.
oh, okay, all right, I'm sorry.
Just saying.
But I'd just like to assure everybody that I do read my emails occasionally. Something will slip by.
Oh, yeah, they're
Who's up next then?
Air.
Air, okay, Air. What's your take on this?
So, Mr. Chair, the town of Air historically has had a very strong relationship with Fort Devens throughout history, and just to frame it, and of course the legacy of the fort, lives on in a lot of our neighborhoods and throughout the town. Just highlighted on ours some of the major areas that are within the historic boundaries of Air, the Massachusetts National Guard facility. The town of Air does have an intermunicipal agreement with Mass Development to provide local veterans services through the town's Veterans Service Agent. The Shepley Hill landfill, the federal Superfund site, within our boundaries and our Board of Health and Select Board over the years, a lot of work on that. The Oxbow National Wildlife Area, a portion of that is within the boundary of Air along the Nashua River between Air and Shirley. The Shriver Job Corps, a federal job training facility within Air, and the Moore Airfield, all within the boundaries of Air. And then just as I mentioned on the scenario, we do have a strong relationship. A lot of what was discussed by others, we would put together an appropriate plan. Again, the concept of having a liaison or appropriate representative and communication protocol. We would look at some of our existing agreements with military and federal partners up there, and there may be the need for other agreements if disposition happened in a manner in which those boundaries went back to Air.
Okay, very good. Shirley.
Very similar to the other submissions. Obviously, there's a significant military and government presence in Devens, and even though there might not be a lot of them that would fall directly into the Shirley historic boundaries, we would want to maintain good communication and a relationship with them. So whether it be a liaison, but basically establishing ongoing communication with them. So.
Very good. Harvard is at a bit of a disadvantage. Historically, Harvard has had less interaction with Devens and Air and Shirley have. So we've got some catching up to do. As I mentioned, the next time the issue is voting. So that should be interesting.
Mr. Chair, if I may, I have a request of everyone. So our next meeting is on April 9th, and I would like all information that is to go into the packet, meeting minutes, answers to the matrix questions, not that I'm looking at anybody in particular, to be to me by close of business on Thursday, April 3rd.
Thursday, April 3rd.
So that I only have to do one packet.
Yep.
Okay. So.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, so,
That's good. And right. Okay.
and other than that, I think we're done. We have, well, for agenda items, it looks like it's gonna be pretty much the same. The standard, working group update. Do we still wanna do the Healy Driscoll Housing Economic Bill working update?
I would think so,
Yes.
because they would
Okay.
have had a meeting on the first.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right. And then, under old business, I would recommend just taking off the CEO update unless something happens. And then we can always put it under new business. And then, of course, we're gonna have question 11, for,
Question 12.
question 12, voting issues. So that would be my recommendation.
Okay.
And Victor's draft letter.
Victor's draft
that-
letter.
Would that come under the DJFC working group, Neil, or do you want to?
Whatever you think. I just didn't want to forget that it's an item for next meeting's agenda. So as long as you remember.
No, we will remember. Okay, well, just to be sure, we'll put something on the agenda to that, in that respect.
So we do a working group update / draft letter, or you want to separate? Well, we'll talk.
Yep. Okay.
Okay.
So, just off topic, I heard a rumor that came to me via a Devens resident that the South Post may be closing. Has anyone heard that? Or Neil, have you heard anything?
Oh, I think
I
I know
have
what
not heard
I think
that.
I know what you're talking about.
What am I talking about?
I think I know what you're talking about. The
It
training.
was on fire last night.
That I don't know. But I think there's the training center out there. They're not going to be doing it anymore. So they're
Oh
closing
yes, the reverse.
because
reserve
they've run out of
forces
funding.
training.
Right. So they've run out of
Yeah.
funding.
Yeah,
So-
that was in the paper last week, I believe.
Okay.
Yeah. So that part is closing, yeah.
I think the South Post is bigger than that.
Right, so it's just that particular
Okay.
section.
Well, that clears.
They were supposed to have like regularly scheduled training events or whatever, and they've had to end that. I forgot what date, but it might be the end of this week, or it might have happened last week.
Okay.
That part is ending because they run out of funding.
Okay, that clears that up.
And they said it was going to be stopped indefinitely. We don't know how long indefinitely is, so.
Okay.
So.
Public comment. Please speak.
Can I clarify that, because there's a little bit of back and forth at the Devens committee meeting. Supertown meeting, there'll be three towns voting? Devens wouldn't have its own vote?
No.
Yes?
3 times.
I guess the other clarification and/or, depending on, and this is more of a housing thing than jurisdiction maybe, but if there's a rezoning, which I guess does affect the jurisdiction, is there more than one option in terms of rezoning the ITC area? And I'm saying partial, as opposed to entire rezone.
So the question is when we get to the subject of rezoning the ITC area, is there more than one option other than adding housing?
Not necessarily. Is there more than one option other than rezoning the whole thing residential? Example, there are bachelor's quarters over there, 3 apartment buildings that would be less expensive and faster to market than anything you do at Vicksburg.
Okay. I think that's
So-
a great question for the housing working group, probably. Neil,
Well,
did,
I could probably answer part of that, Mr. Chair.
Sure.
The ITC district does include the BOQs, the Bachelor Officers Quarters. And they are looking at the entire district, not just Vicksburg Square. And the proposal isn't just to change it to residential. It's right now it's looking at allowing residential as an additional allowed use. There are existing businesses that currently operate within the ITC district. So, business use would still be allowed. Any housing just has to be compatible with, existing and surrounding land uses.
I guess, just to clarify, could you vote to rezone just the BOQ and leave the rest ITC?
That's
All options are on the table,
Okay.
but I don't know. I can't speak for the whole group.
Could you identify yourself? I'm sorry.
Sorry, Richard Enright, 19 Chan Street, Devens.
Okay.
Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Richard. Okay, we've come to any more public comment? Okay, we've come to the end of our agenda. Is there a motion to adjourn? We have
Second.
all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say nay.
Aye.
Without objection, the vote is unanimous. We are adjourned.